From the beginning of time, there have been stories and mythologies of heavenly interactions and contact between our ancient ancestors and extraterrestrial entities. Cave art, mythology, and stories passed down through the ages tell of events and interactions between our species and these entities. From the Dogon in West Africa to the Aboriginal Wandjina in Australia to the cave art in Valcamonica, which depicts beings that resemble astronauts. What's more, contact between our ancestors and extraterrestrials are also depicted in ancient scripture, such as that of Ezekiel's wheel or the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, or that angels derive their name from angelos, which means messengers in Latin, messengers from where or who, and that these angels were able to change and take the form of humans when they required to. Currently, the mainstream media and Twitter's trending section seems to be filled with articles and news regarding UFOs and UAPs. These articles and reports seem to be supported or positively briefed by the U.S. government. The mainstream media, who previously dismissed reports of UFOs as crazy talk or conspiracy theory, is now reporting UFOs with a positive light and are giving the UFO agenda a legitimate angle. Whereas the message from the U.S. government for the past 50 years was anything but supportive, and any sightings were dismissed as terrestrial vehicles such as planes or weather balloons or light phenomena. And claims of close encounters were dismissed or attributed to people with psychological issues or unhinged personalities. And alien abduction stories were completely dismissed. And people who said that they had been abducted by aliens were referred to as plain crazy. And when members of the public said that aliens existed or that they had close encounters with alien beings and that the government was hiding the truth, they were called conspiracy theorists and dismissed. So what has changed now? Why is the U.S. government currently supporting the UFO narrative and UFO stories and is now positively briefing the mainstream media regarding UFOs and UAPs and actively encouraging U.S. pilots to report and record any UFO sightings? But for a long time, air traffic controllers, Navy pilots, and commercial pilots were actively discouraged from reporting any sightings to the point that they could risk losing their job. One has to ask the question why all of a sudden the same U.S. government that dismissed people like Bob Lazar, who claimed to have seen UFOs and who claimed to have witnessed various alien spaceships being reverse engineered in Area 51, were dismissed. For 30 years, the U.S. government dismissed Bob Lazar and tried to ruin his career and his livelihood. However, Bob Lazar is the crux of this argument, because if the U.S. government is telling the truth, and the U.S. government doesn't have a good track record of telling the truth, the U.S. government should be agreeing with Bob Lazar, as Lazar has been saying the same thing that the U.S. government is now promoting for the past 30 years, which is that UFOs exist and that alien spaceships exist and that America has been reverse engineering these in S4 Area 51. But the fact is, the U.S. government dismisses Bob Lazar and his story. The U.S. government is dismissing Lazar based on his supposed educational background discrepancies. Well, the truth is, one doesn't have to be an Ivy League school graduate or a physicist from MIT in order to be able to tell whether you've seen a spaceship or not. A spaceship is not easily confused with a bicycle. So to use Lazar's lack of qualifications or his possible dishonesty regarding his qualifications is invalid in trying to dismiss him when it comes to actually witnessing an extraterrestrial spaceship or a vehicle that defies the laws of gravity and the laws of physics as we know it on our planet. The truth of the matter is that these UAPs, actively promoted by the U.S. government, more than likely belong to a secret military program being run by the U.S. government. And if they were to agree with Bob Lazar, or if they were to support Lazar's claims of reverse engineering in Area 51, then the American government will have to take accountability for these vehicles and admit that Lazar was telling the truth, which has ramifications for the integrity of the intelligence community and the U.S. government in regards to its future discretions. As if they were to admit that Bob Lazar was telling the truth, they'd have to then admit that they were lying, which means that their credibility would be brought into question on past and present events. If they were to agree with Bob Lazar, they would then have to admit that reverse engineering in Area 51 did happen, and reverse engineering of alien spaceships from other dimensions or other planetary systems did happen. But the U.S. government does not want to admit that these UAPs are as a result of reverse engineering, and that this technology has been either reverse engineered from technology or knowledge that's either from a different dimension or from a different galaxy, or that there's been a breakthrough in anti-gravitational sciences. So instead, the U.S. government is actively promoting the story that these entities are not from this planet. One has to ask themselves why the U.S. government wants to be doing this. Well, this would create the perfect smokescreen for them, as if they had the ability to pertain that these UAPs came from elsewhere other than Earth. Then the U.S. government would have no accountability over any actions that these vehicles were to commit. For example, if ever a sensitive military site was to be blown up in China or Russia, then these UAPs would be the perfect alibi for the U.S. government, as primarily the military site would be taken out, and additionally the victim country would be too embarrassed to admit that their sensitive military site was taken out by a UFO, so they would more than likely remain silent. And that would be a perfect course of action for the U.S. government. And the country that these UAPs were being used against would have no discourse. What would they say? That they were attacked by aliens. They would be mocked on the world stage. If these UAPs were used against the enemy of the United States, these countries could not then point the blame at the U.S., as the U.S. would claim they have no knowledge of these vehicles. And so hence the push for the narrative that these UAPs are not from this planet, hence they are not terrestrial and that they are extraterrestrial, as that fits perfectly with the U.S. narrative when it comes to its foreign policy and its geopolitical goals. So this is why Bob Lazar is being dismissed, because if he were to be believed, then they'd be consequences for the U.S. government. The U.S. government would then have to admit that they had lied, and therefore if they had lied once, then they could be accused of lying on multiple occasions. One has to see who the people are that the U.S. government is using to promote and push the narrative that UAPs are not terrestrial. The first person is Lou Elizondo, a former U.S. Army counterintelligence agent linked to Defense Intelligence and the Pentagon. The second person is Christopher Mellon, who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence under Clinton and George W. Bush, and most likely still to this day has connections with the intelligence community. Let's also discuss the fact that formal whistleblowers, such as Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, are now being actively pursued by the U.S. government, with very long-term prison sentences waiting for both of them. So how come these two supposed whistleblowers, such as Lou Elizondo and Christopher Mellon, are free to speak as they want? The point of this investigation is not to dismiss the concept of aliens or UFOs, as it is a very high probability, almost a certainty, that aliens exist. And there is also a very high probability that they have visited this planet. And there's also a very high probability that something may have happened involving the manipulation of human DNA with either the DNA of these entities or just a manipulation of human DNA by these entities. In ancient history, according to the many texts written by the many great ancient civilizations, such as those in Hinduism and Buddhism in regards to the Vimanas, flying chariots or time travel, or the Sumerians and the creation of humanity by the gods who came down from the skies, or the Egyptians and their link with a supernatural force resonating in Orion's belt, juxtaposing to an extraterrestrial or a supernatural divinity in conjecture with human creation. The purpose of this investigation is not to dismiss aliens or UFOs, as these two are very likely to exist and are very likely to have visited Earth and are likely to still visit Earth. In regard to ancient evidence, there is also excellent modern-day evidence of alien and UFO visitation and abductions. Some of these include Travis Walton, who was a forest logger and was abducted in Arizona. His abduction was witnessed by 5 of his friends who all passed a lie detector test afterwards in regards to what had happened, or the abduction of Barney and Betty Hill, who in post-hypnosis were able to regress and describe in detail the details of their abduction.
I can see it tilted toward me. All right, that's all.
A hypnosis regression had to be called off because of the graphic nature and the horrible reaction of Barney Hill, or the alien visitations in Brazil's Varginha, where ordinary people saw aliens running in fields in the neighborhood, and alien bodies were recovered and sent to the United States. But the point of this investigation is to show that the U.S. government is lying to the world, as it has done so many times before, and it's using useful idiots such as Jeremy Corbell to go along with the narrative. And in doing so, it's fooling people into believing the U.S. government and its narrative about UAPs and UFOs. It would be advisable to assume that these UAPs and UFOs that are being promoted by the U.S. government are part of a bigger plan, and this bigger plan may not be entirely beneficial for humanity. It is proposed that today people are too well informed for a third world war to occur. So therefore, the U.S. government are using these UAPs and UFOs to instigate an international incident which can lead to an international conflict. Also, the possibility of a fabricated alien invasion and a subsequent war being commenced by the U.S. government using these UAPs is a likely possibility. In other words, the U.S. government is likely to use these UAPs to create a fake conflict where the U.S. government will state that these UAPs are hostile, but in reality, the U.S. government will be in control of these vehicles. And it will then use these vehicles to destroy targets deemed hostile to the United States, which can include cities and populations using controlled methods. As a nuclear world war for the purposes of population control would be a very messy situation because nuclear weapons are very difficult to contain and there are subsequent consequences such as radiation fallout and a nuclear winter. Whereas using controlled vehicles that seemingly defy the laws of physics can take out large areas of population without too much overspill. Or worse still, the U.S. government will create an elaborate alien conflict where some of these UAPs are from a friendly group of aliens, whilst the other UAPs are from a hostile group of aliens, whilst all the while controlling both sets of vehicles and then using this proposed and fabricated conflict to destroy a large portion of the human population. For example, using these supposed UAPs can be a very effective form of population control, and this investigation proposes that reducing world population is one of the proposed intentions of these UAPs by the U.S. government, as a reduction in world population is one of the best ways to prevent future revolutions, as revolutions are one of the main ways that those in power lose their money and position. For example, the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution reduced the aristocratic population, and because of the power of communism, social mobility was instigated for the first time in Western society. So getting rid of humanity, or rather getting rid of people, is a great way to ensure that there's not going to be any revolutions in the future, and that those in power can maintain their position in society. For example, recently the Pentagon has announced that a possible alien mothership could be within the vicinity of Earth's orbit. This investigation proposes that the CIA and the Pentagon are working with one specific TV program to reveal a fake alien or extraterrestrial revelation. This program is called The Curse of Skinwalker Ranch, based in the Uinta Basin. The CIA and the U.S. government will create a false flag, which will include the unearthing or the supposed discovery of an archaeological alien vehicle or discovery, that they will use this to sell the idea that aliens and UFOs have always existed. But these flying vehicles that are being reported are most likely built by the United States government. Further evidence that these UAPs might be the product of the U.S. military are the sightings of UFOs in the conflict involving Ukraine and Russia. As numerous reports have come through of UFOs being seen and observed over Ukraine within the zone of conflict, it makes sense that the United States is testing its new vehicles over a conflict zone. And it could also make sense why the United States is so reticent to sue for peace in Ukraine, because it knows that it has the technological upper hand, and that nothing that Russia or China can offer in terms of military hardware can come close to these UAPs that the United States seems to have in its inventory. Only time will tell what the outcome will be and why the U.S. government wants to promote an open position in regards to sensitive military information. Does it have an alternative motive? This investigation highly proposes that this is the case. Watch this space.